Can you remember what pub culture really looked like in the 1980s Britain? It wasn't just about warm beer and smoky rooms, it was a battlefield where tradition fought modernity for the soul of British social life. Every corner pub held court like a medieval hall, where working-class philosophers solved world problems over pints of bitter that cost less than 80 pence. Yet behind those nicotine-stained walls, something extraordinary was happening. The very institutions that seemed eternal were teetering on extinction, saved only by a revolution nobody saw coming. One that would transform soggy crisps and flat lager into a cultural renaissance that still shapes how we drink today. The 1980s pub scene emerged from the ashes of the 1970s brewery monopolies, when 6 massive companies, Allied, Bass, Courage, Grand Metropolitan, Scottish and Newcastle, and Whitbread, controlled nearly everything you drank. CAMRA, the campaign for real ale, had been battling since 1971, but it was in the 80s when their crusade truly caught fire. These weren't just beer snobs in tweed jackets, though there were plenty of those. They were cultural warriors fighting against the homogenization of British drinking culture. Real ale in the 80s meant something profoundly different from today's craft beer movement. These were living beers, still fermenting in the cellar, pulled through hand pumps by landlords who knew exactly when each cask reached perfection. The temperature mattered. Not cold like the fizzy lagers creeping in from the continent, but cool around 11 to 13 degrees Celsius, where the complex flavours of British hops and malts could properly express themselves. What most people forget is how close we came to losing it all. By the early 1980s, the big breweries were pushing keg beers hard. Pasteurized, filtered, force-carbonated products that lasted longer and required less skill to serve. They marketed these as modern and consistent, implying that real ale was somehow backwards and unreliable. The Big Six controlled 75% of beer production and owned 3/4 of Britain's tied houses. The real scandal of the decade came with the beer orders of December 1989, statutory instruments that restricted the number of tied pubs that could be owned by large breweries in the United Kingdom to 2,000. This government intervention meant to increase competition, accidentally saved British brewing culture from corporate extinction. Overnight, the landscape changed. Independent landlords could suddenly stock whatever beers they wanted, leading to an explosion of choice that would have been unthinkable at the decade's start. And here's where it gets interesting. If you're enjoying these forgotten stories about British pub culture, make sure to hit that subscribe button because we're about to reveal something about 80s pubs that even your dad probably doesn't remember. Walk into any 80s pub on a Tuesday night and you'd find serious competition underway. Not just casual games, but league matches with trophies, prize money, and local pride at stake. Darts wasn't merely throwing arrows at a board, it was mathematical warfare, where working men who'd left school at 15 could calculate out finishes faster than a computer. The dartboards themselves tell a story. Bristleboards made from sisal fibres, they need rotating every few weeks to prevent wear patterns. Good landlords knew exactly when to turn them, maintaining that perfect playing surface. The oach, that line you stand behind, was precisely 7 feet 9 1/4 inches from the board, measured with religious devotion. Every pub had its local legend, usually named Terry or Big Dave, who could finish on double top with his eyes closed after 8 pints. Pool tables dominated the back rooms, those massive 7-foot slate bed monsters that cost a week's wages to recloth. The 80s saw the great schism between yellow and red balls versus spots and stripes, with regional variations causing heated arguments when teams from different areas met. In Northern England, you played yellows and reds, with specific rules about potting the black that could spark fights if misunderstood. But here's what's truly fascinating. Games like Bat and Trap, Skittles, and Shove Happenny were still thriving in certain regions. Bat and Trap, virtually unknown today, survived in Kent pubs where leather-faced old boys would demonstrate techniques passed down through generations. The game involved hitting a wooden trap to launch a ball, then striking it before it hit the ground. Cricket's violent cousin played in spaces barely bigger than a living room. Table skittles, with its suspended ball on a chain, required a delicate touch that belied the rough hands of its players. Plasterers, bricklayers and mechanics would display surprising finesse, spinning that ball with English that would make a snooker player jealous. These weren't just games, they were social rituals that determined pecking orders and settled disputes without violence. Usually. Before gastropubs and artisanal Scotch eggs, 80s pub food inhabited a strange twilight zone between sustenance and punishment. The pickled egg jar on the bar wasn't decoration. People actually ate them, usually on a dare or after sufficient liquid courage. These eggs, floating in their cloudy brine like specimens in a mad scientist laboratory, had often been there since the previous decade. Pork scratchings weren't the boutique pork crackling you find today. These were industrial-strength toothbreakers, complete with occasional bristles that reminded you this was once an actual pig. The good ones could strip the enamel from your teeth, the bad ones might actually break them. Yet men would crunch through bags of them, washing down the salt and fat with endless pints. The crisp revolution was just beginning. While ready salted and cheese and onion dominated, exotic flavours were creeping in. Prawn cocktail crisps arrived like missionaries from a more sophisticated world, though nobody could explain what they actually tasted like. Spring onion, beef and mustard, Worcester sauce, and these were flavours designed by committees who'd possibly never eaten the things they were supposedly recreating. The sandwich situation deserves special mention. If you were lucky, the landlady might make fresh ones, white bread, margarine, and a filling that was 90% wishful thinking. Ham consisted of one translucent slice you could read through. Cheese was sweaty and pre-sliced, but after 6 pints, they tasted like heaven. The cling film wrapped sandwiches in the display case, gradually curling at the edges like dying flowers, were a last resort, even for the desperately hungry. The soundscape of an 80s pub was dominated by 2 machines, the jukebox and the fruit machine. These weren't just entertainment, they were the economic engines that often kept smaller pubs afloat. A good fruit machine could pull in £200 a week. Serious money when a pint cost 60 to 80 pence. Jukeboxes still played 7-inch singles, requiring someone to physically load new records every few weeks. The selection process was pure democracy. Whatever got played most stayed, whatever didn't got replaced. This created fascinating musical time capsules. You'd find Duran Duran next to Jim Reeves, the Specials rubbing shoulders with Val Doonican. Certain songs became pub anthems through sheer repetition. Come On Eileen wasn't just popular, it was architectural, built into the very walls through constant play. The fruit machines were primitive compared to today's computerized bandits, but they had personality. Regular players knew their quirks. Which machine paid out after showing 3 melons, which one never released its hold feature before taking 20 quid. The sounds are burned into a generation's memory. The mechanical clunk of coins dropping, the electronic ascending scale that meant you were close to winning, the devastating silence when you lost your last quid. Here's a fact that modern drinkers can barely comprehend. Until August 21st, 1988, pubs in England and Wales had to close between 3 p.m. and 5 p.m., Monday through Saturday. This afternoon gap was a relic from World War I, when the government feared munitions workers were getting drunk out at lunchtime. For over 70 years, this bizarre restriction remained, forcing thirsty afternoon drinkers to either stock up at off-licenses or simply wait. Now here's something that'll blow your mind. The average pub in 1983 made more profit from its fruit machine than from food sales. We're diving deep into the bizarre economics of 80s pub culture. But first, remember to like this video if you're learning something new about the decade that fashion forgot. Trying to explain 80s pub smoking culture to modern audiences is like describing colour to the blind. The air wasn't just smoky, it was architectural, a solid presence you could lean against. Visibility across a busy Friday night pub might drop to 15 feet. Your clothes didn't just smell of smoke, they were chemically bonded with it at a molecular level. By 1982, a packet of 20 cigarettes cost around £1, making smoking still relatively affordable for most pubgoers. Cigarette machines were mechanical marvels, these vertical monoliths that dispensed 20 packs. Kids would be sent to buy cigarettes for their parents, no questions asked. The brands tell their own story: Embassy, Silk Cut, Benson and Hedges, John Player Special. Low-tar varieties were just appearing, marketed to the health-conscious smoker, an oxymoron that nobody questioned. The etiquette was complex but unspoken. You could bum a cigarette off a stranger, but you bought them a pint in return. Asking for a light was an acceptable conversation starter. Rolling your own marked you as either very poor or deliberately eccentric. Pipe smokers occupied their own elevated category, tolerated like elderly relatives with questionable habits. The 80s. Pub landlord was a unique species, part businessman, part social worker, part bouncer. They weren't employees but tenants of the brewery, running their pub like a personal fiefdom. The good ones knew everyone's name, their drink, their troubles, and exactly how many pints they could handle before causing problems. These weren't the gastropub managers of today with their hospitality degrees and customer service training. These were characters forged in the furnace of British eccentricity. They might bar you for life for breaking wind during the Queen's speech at Christmas, then let you back in the next week because they felt sorry for you. Their word was law, their pub was their castle, and their regulars were their subjects. The relationship between landlord and brewery was feudal. Breweries owned the building, controlled what beer you sold, and could evict you for virtually any reason. This created a peculiar dynamic where landlords had to balance keeping the brewery happy with keeping their customers loyal. The smart ones walked this tightrope like circus performers, creating the illusion of independence while staying within corporate guidelines. The legendary landlords became local celebrities. They'd organise coach trips to Blackpool, Christmas savings clubs, and charity fundraisers that involved grown men dressing as women for reasons that made sense after 9 pints. They'd extend credit to regulars, keeping elaborate mental tabs of who owed what. Some ran informal banking systems, cashing cheques and lending money at rates that would make modern payday lenders blush. Let's not romanticize it. 80s pubs could be violent places. Friday night fights were so common they had their own terminology. A straightener meant settling differences with fists outside. Glassing entered the vernacular as pint glasses became weapons. The infamous mill wall brick, a newspaper folded into a weapon, was pub self-defense for those who knew trouble was coming. The police approach was radically different from today. They'd often let fights run their course, then arrest whoever was still standing. Community policing meant the local constable knew which pubs had trouble and when. They'd park conspicuously outside at closing time, more as deterrent than enforcement. Drink driving was endemic. The attitude seems prehistoric now, but driving home after 6 or 7 pints was considered normal, even skillful. "I drive better when I've had a few," was an actual argument people made with straight faces. Pub car parks on Friday nights were demolition derbies waiting to happen. The breathalyzer existed, but was rarely used unless you'd actually crashed. The casual discrimination of 80s pubs would trigger modern audiences. Many establishments had unwritten rules about who was welcome and who wasn't. Women in some traditional working men's pubs couldn't order at the bar. They had to send their men. These weren't occasional incidents, but systematic, accepted discrimination that nobody with power questioned. After the official closing time, selected pubs transformed into private clubs. The lock-in was British rebellion at its most refined, technically illegal but culturally essential. Curtains drawn, doors locked, lights dimmed, the chosen few would drink until dawn while maintaining the fiction that they were private guests of the landlord. Getting invited to a lock-in marked your acceptance into the pub's inner circle. These weren't advertised or discussed openly. A meaningful look from the landlord, a subtle nod toward the back room, maybe the phrase, "You staying for afters?" These were your invitation to the secret society. The economics were pure cash, no questions asked. Prices might drop since there was no tax being paid, or they might rise because where else were you going to go? The atmosphere changed completely. Hierarchies dissolved, strangers became friends, and the landlord might actually sit down and have a drink with you. Police knew lock-ins happened but largely turned a blind eye unless complaints were made. The unwritten rule was keep the noise down and don't cause trouble. Break these rules and not only would the police shut you down, but you'd be barred from every pub in a 5-mile radius. The bush telegraph between landlords was faster than the internet and twice as unforgiving. Despite all its flaws, the 80s pub was perhaps the last truly democratic space in British society. Company directors drank next to dustmen, teachers played darts with builders, and social class temporarily dissolved in the universal solvent of alcohol. Your accent, your job, your background, none of it mattered if you bought your round and didn't act like a pillock. This democracy had limits, obviously. The barriers faced by women, minorities, and anyone outside the mainstream were real and often insurmountable. But within its constraints, the pub offered something we've lost, a physical space where different tribes of Britain actually mixed, rather than existing in their own bubbles. The conversations were different too. Without smartphones, people actually talked to strangers. Without social media, arguments had to be settled by memory, leading to epic disputes about football statistics or historical facts that could last weeks. The pub encyclopedia, usually incomplete and decades out of date, was the final arbiter of truth. By 1989, the writing was on the wall. The beer orders were about to reshape the entire industry. Young people were discovering wine bars and clubs with DJs instead of jukeboxes. The traditional pub was evolving or dying, depending on your perspective. The pub codes that emerged from the beer orders would transform the industry, turning pubs into investment vehicles rather than community assets. What had been a complex monopoly of 6 brewing giants became a different kind of monopoly. Pub-owning companies that controlled thousands of venues but brewed no beer themselves. Those who lived through 80s pub culture carry its memories like tribal tattoos, invisible to outsiders but immediately recognizable to fellow survivors. They remember when every pub had personality, when landlords were local legends, when a good night out cost less than a tenner, including chips on the way home. Today's craft beer revolution, gastropub movement and micropub renaissance all have roots in the 80s battles over British drinking culture. The fight for real ale taught consumers they could demand better. The beer orders, despite their flaws, broke the monopolies that stifled innovation. Even the smoking ban, unthinkable in the 80s, emerged from growing awareness that pub culture needed to evolve to survive. The 80s pub wasn't perfect. It was exclusive, unhealthy, and sometimes dangerous. But it was also magical, community-focused, and utterly unique to British culture. It represented something we're still trying to recapture. A third space between work and home where society mixed, problems were solved, and loneliness was temporarily banished. Those pubs are mostly gone now, converted to flats or gastropubs serving small plates at large prices. But occasionally, you'll find one that survived unchanged. Fruit machine chuntering in the corner. Carpets that squelch underfoot. A landlord who remembers when this was all fields. Step inside, order a pint of bitter, and for a moment you're back in 1985 when life was simpler. Beer was cheaper, and everybody knew that tomorrow's problems could wait until tomorrow. If you've enjoyed this journey through the smoky, sticky-floored paradise of 80s pub culture, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell to catch our next deep dive into British history that they definitely didn't teach you at school. And remember, the next time you're in a pristine gastropub eating artisanal pork scratchings and drinking craft IPA, spare a thought for those who went before, the pioneers who fought their battles with warm, bitter and pickled eggs. Cheers, everyone!